Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning Podcast. I'm joined by Brad Kershner. Brad's an integrative thinker, head of school at Kimberton Waldorf School in Pennsylvania. Brad runs a Substack called Integrative Emergence, and most recently, he gave a series of lectures on YouTube. And well, they're on YouTube, and they're also you can get them on podcast apps wherever you get your local podcasts on a number of important topics relating to education, artificial intelligence, cultural polarization, and evolution, etc. And we've been trying to think about trying to have a conversation for a while now. So this just seemed like a great opportunity, building off of this really impressive kind of series that you've put out to give us an opportunity, or at least an excuse to have a chat. So thanks, Brad, for coming on the podcast, and yeah, looking forward to getting into things with you.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. It's been a long time coming. So I'm glad to have an excuse. We've had some good podcast-worthy conversations offline, so it's nice to it's nice to connect online.
Indeed. Yeah, so I mean, again, a lot of people will probably, I'm sure, be familiar with you from this broader space, whether they've engaged your Substack or, you've been uh, thinking really in significant directions relative to integrative approaches to education. And when I think of Brad Kershner, what comes to mind is really a leading edge thinker, particularly in the space of education or educational institutions, and how those are sort of embedded in our particular cultural moment and what the future of education looks like in particular. But with this series that you've done, you really go into a number of topics, and I guess maybe the one we can spend a little bit of time on here because it was rather comprehensive was some of these things around general or our artificial intelligence versus natural intelligence, some of the things that are coming out of that and the cultural impact that they stand to have, and how we can make sense of all these things. So that's just kind of a suggestion for where we could take some of this, but I'm really open to go wherever we want to because there's a lot, and there were some things that you were thinking maybe we could dive into. So anyway, how does that sound for you? And also feel free to tee up anything you'd like to dive into specifically.
Yeah, that sounds good. It's a wide range, so I'm open to whatever you wanted to get into. I know I'll just name too that in my work, I've been working in schools and have been doing a lot of thinking and talking about education, but prior to that, really was focused on religion and philosophy and got my graduate degree was in religious studies, extensive background with Buddhism and meditation. You and I have, been engaged in talks more around the meta-modern spirituality. Um, Sort of field. So also open to that. And because I know that a lot of your work is just, you're just plugging away at really digging and expanding and getting broader and deeper in terms of your worldview around universal learning process, which is a book that I've read. I've actually read a few of your books.
Oh, thanks.
So I'm just sort of in that conversation.
Yeah.
And I've been sort of in the integral theory, emergent meta-modern sort of liminal space conversation. So we could really take it wherever you want to go. And I'll just name that I do think that the last lecture that I gave in my series, which was focused on McGilchrist's work, I do think there's some relevant and salient ideas in that body of work that are relevant to the other kinds of conversations that you're having related to meta-modern spirituality.
Yeah, for sure.
So at some point, I'm assuming that that'll get woven in here.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's dive in. I mean, some things that came up for me when I was looking at your lectures, specifically on the AI stuff. It has a lot to do with this issue of value, and I mean that's a big theme of this podcast and metamodern meaning. Looking at meaning, what is meaning, what is value? That's you mentioned that book that I wrote. That's a big focus of what that is all about and what my work is a
Hmm.
lot about. So trying to think about value and
Hmm.
meaning in this particular moment and the urgency, the necessity of it as well, because
Hmm.
this isn't just sort of we have the luxury of lounging around and philosophically speculating about these in some abstract sense. They are impinging these questions upon us in a very profound, significant way because they're changing how we answer these questions or fail to answer these questions is having a big impact for the world that we're creating around us. And
Hmm.
the technological question is a big part of that. So, yeah, let's start there because there were some terms that you threw out that I found really helpful in one of your presentations, which is this notion of nihilistic design versus axiological design, and the
Hmm.
notion of creating technologies with with value in mind, and if we don't do that, the negative repercussions. And so, why don't
Mhm.
you start there a little bit and frame some of the stuff that you were getting at in that lecture of where we're at right now as cultural trends are moving in a particular direction, informed by a kind of nihilistic design approach, and the problems around that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really about, I think, trying to understand the implications for the sort of underlying and overarching worldviews that are informing a lot of um, the people who have a lot of power in the conversations and then the development of technology. And that sense of nihilistic design versus axiological design, that was actually a reference to a Consilience Project paper. I think it was the tech is not neutral one, where
Hmm.
they're talking about really seeing the impact of technology on consciousness and culture. So we're sort of in this feedback loop where our consciousness and culture is going to influence what kind of technology we create, but then that also is a feedback loop on us. And really coming to grips with the sort of pickle of being in that feedback loop of realizing how do we actually get conscious and thoughtful enough to be designing technology with clear intention and values built in so that it will have a good impact on us as humans. And this really is a big part of the AI conversation. We have to really have the wisdom to slow down and be thoughtful and deliberate. But we can only do that if we first sort of have a worldview where we acknowledge how impacted we are by our environments and technology. We don't have sort of misguided or naive understandings about how we can move fast and break things and create tech that is going to be harmful, but we're almost acting like it may not be, or we're almost acting like we have no choice, or we're almost acting like it doesn't matter. Like there's lots of sort of semi-conscious motivations and drives and confused thoughts, I think, that are behind a lot of the behavior that's happening collectively and individually. And really, the gesture is to sort of slow down, come back to some first principles thinking, thinking about what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to cultivate and develop human natural intelligence? What kind of environments are necessary for that to go well? How do we actually create educational, developmentally appropriate environments for humans to grow up in? What are the implications of all those things for how we design our tech? And really, underneath all that is a critique of the worldviews that fundamentally deny the basic sort of principles that we need to build
Hmm.
a healthy civilization on top of, right?
Yeah.
And that's when you get into like there are dominant forms of determinism, materialism, that sort of terrestrial, transhumanist, effective, altruist, accelerationist worldview. Like we have to understand the worldview we're dealing with so that we can see what's wrong with it and the impact that it's having on us and the kind of principles and wisdom that we need to go in a better and different direction.
Well, that was beautifully, eloquently, and wonderfully expressed because I totally agree. And there's so much there, and these are the big questions that we need to be asking. Otherwise, we're
Mhm.
setting ourselves up for disaster at multiple levels.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and these are the questions that you're asking in the series, and I think so. One of the things I want to do is dig into some of those questions, and because
Hmm.
there's it's kind of a common recognition, well, at least in these circles, I think at this point that absent the ability to talk about value in sort of positive terms, you get a kind of vacuum, a kind of axiological vacuum of this sort of value nihilism, let's just call it, a nothing, the
Hmm.
inability to express positive affirmations of value that then gets filled by essentially market forces with
Hmm.
the various incentives and logic of a kind of neoliberal world order, various other kind of worldviews implicitly behind the kind of technological drives moving us in a particular direction. All this happens sort of absent people being able to say, no, like this is what we actually want and care and should care about, and this would be bad. So the legacy of a kind of postmodern relativistic moment is really the backdrop for a lot of these big meta crisis and meaning crisis issues. Because unless we can get right about value and meaning, then, yeah, the transhumanist vision in which maybe all life gets obliterated, but we've created some cool robots that go into space or something is sort of just as good as any other story. So it behooves us. It's always a ridiculous word, but it behooves us to talk about these things and get some sense around them. Just as an example, I love this. Well, I shouldn't say I loved it. I hated it. It was it was really disgusting. But you had this quote from a Harper's
Mm.
magazine article about some of the directions that our current kind of culture is going in light of a culture of sort of attention capture and just the diffusion of sort of quality attention and care given to things in the world as people will turn on television and just scroll on their phone, and increasingly nothing really is of any value, but nothing really. So anyway, there's this new kind of approach to programming that Netflix is doing that's sort of geared to basically make just really low significant. Well, I'll let you be able to describe it in a second. But like, well, anyway, here's the quote to give people a sense of this. So, Netflix leadership has begun mandating that shows and movies which fall into this new category feature lots of dialogue where characters clearly explain what they're doing and announce their intentions. The purpose is to ensure that users who aren't watching and are only partly paying attention can keep up with the story and follow along while distracted. The result is an abundance of exposition by characters recapping things they just did, are doing, or are about to do. And I'm like, oh man, not only is that just like, a vapid sort of future for culture. But it's also, as you mentioned, that kind of recursive thing, right? Like imagine a whole generation socialized or enculturated through media that works that way, right? Imagine no longer being able to have the sensitivity to communicating through, let's say nuance and suggestion and the kind of richness of communicative strategies if everyone's sort of normatively socialized into a context where when I enter a room I announce what I am doing and my intentions, and it's like we actually wind up becoming more robot-like in this sort of dystopian world that we're entering because of these dynamics. So I just wanted to name that because I thought I was like, oh my gosh, like this is sort of where
Yeah.
some nihilistic design takes us. But anyway, yeah, what are your thoughts about
Yeah,
this?
just quick thought on that. I mean, yeah, it's a sign of a broader thing that we have to be aware of and take very seriously, which is we are experiencing a very significant degeneration and regression in culture. And the implications on civilization are quite immense when we think about the kind of normalization of dumbing down, the normalization of decreased attention spans, the normalization of not even being able to attend to a TV show is sort of where we're at, that quote's getting to. Another example I'll name, which maybe you can even link in the notes or something. Persuasion came out with a article a couple days ago called "The Average College Student is Illiterate." And I
Yeah.
actually wrote a message to my school community and kind of wove that in as a link just yesterday because it's just a striking example of, and it's funny, and since I've done that, several people have reached out to me with their own examples of working with teenagers and college age students and just how much the norms of engagement and attention and seriousness have degraded really just over the past 10 to 15 years. And my sense is that there's still a lot of denialism and a lot of naivete in terms of how big the impact of our sort of digital technosphere has been on human culture and particularly on young people and folks who are even younger than you and I. And we haven't
Yeah.
really come to terms with it. We haven't really suffered the full consequences of it yet, but there's a lot of really, really bad signs.
No, I totally agree with that. But I want to play devil's advocate for a second, right? And because I think we need to deal with this rhetorically, strategically, and think about if we are seeing these problems, what can we do about it? When I think a lot of well-meaning people will say, well, people have always said this, and and not only that, I think that there's a way in which these particular issues uh, in our political landscape seem to be sort of subsumed by people on the right or in the conservative sort of spectrum, where it's sort of like, we must defend culture, we must stand up for values and this sort of thing. People code people who speak in these ways as like, oh, I guess you must be some reactionary singing your Jeremiads about the fall, and then there is, I mean, I don't want to dismiss that. Like, this is the tension I'm trying to get at. We're seeing this rise of sort of neo-reactionary, quasi-fascistic kinds of things showing up in culture, and there's been a reaction to a lot of things happening where you do have people who are like, we need to save Western civilization and these sorts of things. So what I'm getting at is like, there's a lot of that stuff out there, and I worry that this issue, which is super important and shouldn't be partisan or polarized in that sense, is going to tend to get coded as sort of people who care about these things must be, conservative reactionaries. And don't we know that people have been saying these sorts of things for time immemorial and that sort of thing? So I'd just be curious if you've encountered any of that, or if you have any thoughts on that kind of dynamic.
Yeah, well, I'd advocate for not reinforcing that association because it's not a really strong one. And actually, I think that this tech issue really does hold out a really good and strong possibility to be a truly transpartisan issue that a lot of people can get behind. And I
Mm,
know people like Jonathan Haidt are doing a good job
yeah.
of getting out there and really connecting in a transpartisan way. I think people across the spectrum of society can sort of see what's happening. And actually one thing I haven't listened to, but since I sent out this message yesterday, one thing that came back to me was people telling me about a podcast that Haidt had with Ezra Klein recently.
Mm,
And I glanced at it and I saw in the comments really quickly, it was like it was a more conservative person commenting like, well, Ezra Klein is such an idiot. He's like anti-Trump or whatever, but like I totally agree with what Jonathan Haidt's saying, right? But this is a left sort of audience that I think Haidt and Ezra are speaking more to.
hmm
So that's just one example of it. It really does cut through, and I think it's actually another reason why we need to beat the drum more and focus on the issue more because it actually has the opportunity and possibility and potential to cut through all the partisan polarized bullshit and really get to the things that actually matter for everyone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how would you express some of this for people who are maybe left of center, who have an allergy for when people start talking about, the end of culture and these kinds
Yeah,
of
I
narratives?
don't see it. I'm not experiencing it as a right coded argument. I
No,
feel
okay.
like I am mostly talking to left-leaning people. I feel like Haidt is mostly talking to left-leaning people. Ezra Klein is talking about it with most left-leaning people. People like Nicholas Carr, who just has a new book out. It's funny, actually, I saw that Nicholas Carr has a new book out. I like him. I've read several of his books. So I glanced at it on Amazon. And one of the first comments was actually very similar. It was from a right-leaning person saying, "Oh, why did he have to say something political at the beginning of the book to be like to show that he's anti-Trump? Like he's clearly speaking to a left audience and actually signaling that he's anti-Trump." And people on the right are actually the ones who are not appreciating it when people like Haidt and Carr signal that they're on the left because it is a transpartisan issue.
Yeah.
So what I see more is actually left-leaning people spreading the message to the well-informed, educated people on the left who are reading books like books by Jonathan Haidt and books by Nicholas Carr. That's almost all the left that's reading those books. But actually, there's people on the right who are also seeing the problem and wishing that they had people who were even less partisan than Carr and Haidt because it is such a transpartisan issue. That's my take on it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, as I said, I
Yeah.
was kind of playing devil's advocate.
Yeah.
It's hard rhetorically to sound alarm bells when, I don't know, in my experience, there tends to be these things tend to get polarized into a particular way. I
Mm.
mean, I care a lot about, I don't know, I'm gonna, I guess, sound nerdy for a second, but like, I love Shakespeare. I love the classics. When I spent 4 years living in an artist collective and just tried to read, as much as I could, going all the way back and then into the present day, like this incredible treasury, this wealth that we have, that is also cross-cultural. It's this depth of kind of the human cultural tradition, that I think the humanists in some profound way understand the deep value of. Like, I see that profoundly being lost, and in terms of general engagement, and I think that we're kind of losing touch with something really significant about our collective human heritage, I guess, in some ways. And so
Yeah.
anyway, so I'm very
Yeah.
sensitive to that, and I've cared a lot about that, but I've tended to encounter pushback primarily from people who, once you talk like that, you start getting coded as,
Mm.
oh, I guess you're some kind of reactionary, like,
Yeah.
yeah, we've got to save the Great Western Canon or something like that. And,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. So that's
Yeah,
just,
well, that's sad and unfortunate, but maybe it's also because if you're emphasizing more those things that you just emphasized, that you'd be more likely to get that response. But you can be arguing for taking seriously the same problems, but if you're more focused on like children and
mm.
education and like the tech effects on kids, then I think you get a different sort of reaction.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that. I mean, you're seeing that
Mhm.
some of that firsthand, though in probably a very different way because you're at a Waldorf school and there's a very different kind of educational pedagogical philosophy there. But it the schools are in trouble, the education system is in trouble, and this technological aspect is sort of ramping that up to a whole new level. So I don't know, speak to some of that and set some of that up because I feel like that's really crucial and really important for the stuff that you're also focusing on.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's very hard to know what the path forward is when thinking about education at scale. I don't know. I do think that our public education systems and really, frankly, just our public youth culture is not in a good place right now. And at the individual level, at the small community level, the best advice I can give is the advice that I've tried to follow for myself is to find an island of sanity, find a like-minded community, find the most healthy subculture that you can find to raise your children in. Try to find a place where people are actually raising their children together with shared values. I'm trying to be a part of and build a community that's actually transpartisan and rooted in shared values that are not reducible or easily identified with any sort of the polarization that's happening. It's possible, but my sense is that the kind of reality that I'm co-creating here is pretty rare, and I don't know how to scale it. I have no argument for how to scale it. I think that, my friend Zach Stein has some ideas about like the future and how to like decentralize. And I love that vision, but I don't see a way to get from here to there.
Hmm.
I feel like we have to reorient more towards some of the underlying cultural things that are even more broad than education. Like it's not really about schools, it's about culture. It's not just about schooling, it's about parenting really and thinking and like to what degree are we able to have a a better average relationship between humans and technology. Where is the evolution of AI going to go? Like the evolution of AI, the evolution of the relationship between humans and digital tech is going to end up being what has the big impact on the next generation, even more so than whatever our school system happens to be.
Yeah. Well, so let's get into some of that philosophical stuff then, those first
Mm.
principles, as you suggested, that we
Hmm.
kind of need to go to if we're going to answer
Hmm.
these value
Hmm.
questions, right? So,
Hmm.
you know, yeah, I guess just we've set up the context. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you answer these questions? How do we talk about value? And again, this is a big theme of this podcast and the work that I do in general, after particularly kind of postmodern deconstruction, value relativism, and the genuine insights that come from recognizing that the values that we give, that we receive from our culture are, culturally embedded and culturally constructed and are imbued and related to various power dynamics, et cetera. All that, how do we move through that to still being able to say beyond that, like, yeah, but we can also talk about value and we do
Hmm.
it this way. How do you square that circle?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to do is and sort of, this is the underlying impulse of the lecture series that I'm giving, is to try to help people come into a story about what it means to be a human that is informed by a lot of historical input. Like I think part of the shared project that you and I have is sort of telling a story about how we got to where we are. That includes an understanding of the different epochs and ages that we've been through. What does it
Hmm.
mean to move from a pre-modern to a modern to a postmodern to a meta-modern sensibility? I think that some evolutionary story is necessary. My sense is that we have to have a shared story that can actually hold the complexity of the planetization that we're going through. We need a planetary story. So the sort of omega or directionality that I see for us culturally is having a planetary story that really includes everyone and everything. And that through fleshing that story out, we can understand what are the problems and the pitfalls that we've fallen into and the nature of those problems and pitfalls, this sort of cultural, degraded cul-de-sac that we're in has to do with the modern world, right? And what's beautiful about the little microculture that I have found myself in is that actually Waldorf education and Steiner is founded on an understanding of the problems of the modern world. So it's
Hmm.
emerging from a story of seeing what is this big shift that is modernity? How is that changing how people are being educated and raised and coming to self-understanding? How is it related to the very deep and pernicious tendency toward materialism? And really fleshing out what materialism is and what it portends for humanity is a big part of the story because we have to have a larger narrative that helps us understand why we fell into a materialistic modern world and how we're going to get out of it and what it means to get out of it. So we have to have a sense of what does it mean to be a human that is not materialistic and not reductionistic and not stuck in a sort of modern paradigm. So how we got into the modern paradigm and how we get out of it, what's wrong with it and what's needed. So that's the sort of frame, and maybe we can poke and prod at that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, this is where some of these deep philosophical questions start to become really essential to the conversation, and
Hmm.
that, and I've talked to Zach Stein a number of times about this in person and in recorded
Hmm.
conversations too, where yeah, we're
Hmm.
asking profoundly similar questions and we have profoundly similar projects, but we might at some points diverge on some of the metaphysical specifics. But like, so to that point, right?
Hmm.
Do you think that in a sense, the only answer, the only story that works is some kind of non-materialistic, accounting for, I guess we would say, consciousness, that there's something like a panpsychism or an idealism or some different framing than how people are talking about the human, phenomenological experience, that is at the core of this or something?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few different things that we can sort of refer to help us through this.
Yeah.
Um, One is the sort of left-right hemisphere frame. I think that's helpful. So, like my last lecture really goes into McGilchrist's work because what I pull from that as a way to really help us understand when we think about some of these big concepts like freedom, value, meaning, evolution, whatever our sort of worldview is, one big insight I think that we can have is to see how we've developed conceptual architectures and conceptual schemas and stories and maps, and we've gotten kind of lost in them. Like we've almost come to have a relationship of idolatry toward them, right? Like another touch point for me is Owen Barfield, who's
Hmm.
important because he sort of is tracing this evolution in a way where basically he sees the story of humanity as having come from a place of original participation. So when we think of the pre-modern world, we think of Barfield's notion of original participation where there was no separation. Meaning was immediate and lived and
Hmm.
experienced. And we came to sort of separate ourselves and be more self-consciously bifurcated. And we created this bifurcation between mind and matter. And we created this more dualistic, materialistic relationship to the world. We lost our sense of original participation. We started to develop what he called alpha thinking. Another way of looking at that is switching back to McGilchrist's frame, we sort of moved from a right hemisphere dominant to a left hemisphere dominant
Hmm.
orientation. And in that process, what's happened over these past few hundred years is people have more and more been relating to their ideas and their concepts about reality as though they're real, as though they're
Hmm.
independent of themselves. And the move that we need to make, I think, is beautifully dialectical in the sense of like in Barfield's term, it's moving into something which he calls final participation. So there's a dialectic from original participation to separation and alpha thinking of modernity to final participation, which is sort of a construct aware, conscious, imaginative, participatory creation of concepts, but with awareness that they're concepts in right relationship to
Mm.
your own mind,
Hmm.
basically. And that's really this very similar move that McGilchrist is trying to make with seeing the dialectic between from right to left to then back to right, integrating the left. But the point there is that we're going through this process of coming into relationship with our own minds and our own schema and concepts about the world. And so much of our thinking, our philosophy, our sociology, so the sort of world of ideas of the past few hundred years has been taking place amongst people who are like actually really strongly in a left hemisphere dominant mode and orientation and don't yet understand what it means to have right relationship to their own
Hmm.
thoughts and are actually in what Barfield calls an idolatist relationship, like thinking that their concepts and ideas and schemas are more real than they are, and not fully acknowledging the participatory, embodied, experiential
Yeah.
nature of the unfolding that they're participating in. So that's kind of my sense of the movement. Like where we're at in that movement is now we're bumping up against the real limits of, what Gebser called the deficient mental, what Barfield called alpha thinking, and what McGilchrist is calling a sort of left hemisphere dominant orientation. We're bumping up against the limits of all of that. And I think much of the best philosophy, of the past few hundred years has been trying to come to terms with this in different ways, whether through the pragmatists or Whitehead or the phenomenologists like Husserl or Heidegger in his late writing. They're all kind of bumping up against the limits of the mind and the limits of duality and materialism and trying to find their way back into some sort of final participatory reality of being or absolute subjectivity or phenomenological disclosure. So that's sort of some of the ways that I think about it.
Yeah, again, very, very well said. I mean, I would, so again, a lot of that profoundly resonates with me, and I think that there's a lot of shared framing there. It is, though, it's largely, again, like problem framing. It's like, here's what we've done wrong. It's not necessarily saying, and here's the way that we resolve
Hmm.
this. I mean, you gestured to some people who are talking about some of the what that could look like. But so I want to come back to that because I kind of
Yeah,
teed you up with like a notion about consciousness, but you got it, I think, a more important kind of broader framing, which is like, what we're struggling with is like the role of our experience in reality as our lived experience, and in a world in which we basically are just inundated with these like these ideas and these objectivized notions that we're kind of taking for more real than our own lived experience. So how do we bring in the actual
yeah,
phenomenological, subjective, conscious
yeah,
experience of being alive back into the equation, and how that can kind of heal this kind of ridiculous,
yeah,
hyper modern world that we've created for ourselves. So there's all that, but I mean, I guess one question I'll ask you quickly around all this is like, why do you suppose the postmodern move didn't really seem to succeed with some of this? Because one could argue a lot of the postmodern after the modern was trying to account for a lot of this. It was like, hey, you're making all this, positivistic, third person, objectivizing, view from nowhere kinds of claims. We've got to come back. We've got to see the first person. We've got to see subjectivity. We've got to see cultural embeddedness, all that, right? But that whole project arguably, didn't resolve this, and raise some other problems along the way,
yeah.
it's of its own. So yeah, why do you think that is? What was going on with that approach?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a mix of different things. I think in some meaningful way, what we're referring to when we refer to that postmodern thinking is a sort of like it is the deficient mental
Hmm.
in Gebser's terminology. It is still a very left hemisphere dominant orientation. It's actually sort of the extreme, like high cognitive complexity, left hemisphere dominant, deficient mental, like apex of like, what does the world start to look like when you're stuck in this self-enclosed,
Yeah.
self-referential world of symbols and signs and you don't know how to get out of it? Like,
Yeah.
that's what postmodern philosophy is. It's like signs referring to signs referring to signs. There is no direct experiential,
Yeah.
final participatory, right hemisphere breakthrough, awakening. And actually, I think awakening is the right word because the lens now, the other whole sort of field of discourse we have to bring in is religion,
Mm,
right? And mysticism and the contemplative traditions and lineages. And sort of, I've benefited personally from sort of starting in my 20s is spending a lot of time with Buddhism and developmental psychology and Wilber. And if you go back and read like The Atman Project by Ken Wilber, right? And you read A Sociable God, like I feel like those are two books that are really overlooked by a lot of people who might refer to Ken Wilber but haven't actually read a lot of his books. If you go back and sort of look at the sort of breakdown and explanation of the developmental process, from birth to Buddha, right? And like he complexified that and critiqued that and made it even more integral and more complicated and complex with like the four quadrants and everything. But there's still a lot of truth and importance and insight if you just look at somebody like Aurobindo or Gebser or Wilbur's early work and you start to understand the stages and you start to think about what do people say and do when they have direct experiences of value and truth, and they're making value claims and truth claims within religious lineages. And you do have this sort of perennial philosophy that we're still left with. If you read the Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley, if you go through and look at some of the core religious teachings, the more esoteric teachings from many religious traditions, we do still have this wealth of knowledge and wisdom and insight about what the world looks like actually from something like a more final participatory point of view, I think. So then the question is, okay, how do we ascertain which perspectives are speaking from that more from that place that's already actually resolved some of these postmodern questions in themselves? What does it mean to have resolved those problems? And what's the path to get there experientially? Because you can never reduce the words of the spiritual teacher with a left hemisphere interpretation of the concepts, right? Like then you just are stuck with this dilemma between the Tao that can be spoken and
hmm
the Tao that's trying to be spoken. Like there is in some way a direct experiential sort of what Zach and Mark are calling anthro-ontological, like, phenomenological insight that is the resolution of all these problems. And then we use language to try to articulate what we learn from the top of the mountain, but you have to actually climb to the top of the mountain, and we have to wait to ascertain, you know, where are people at and where are they speaking from?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this gets to, again, some really interesting,
Yeah,
different approaches to how we
yeah,
try to resolve these things. And I think there's a lot of merit to all that for sure. It's, as I'll say in a second, not the, at least the approach that I particularly emphasize though. But I would do also want to say before I get to that, totally agree with what you were saying about postmodernism and the getting lost in the endless deferral of meaning and all that. It is a kind of hyper deficient mentalization to the extreme, and then it gets you fundamentally disconnected from your own lived experience, where
yes,
you can actually start saying,
yes.
I actually, this really happened. This is a real story. I ran into actually a friend of my brother's one night. This was back when I was in high school, and this was late. It was, I don't know, 11 p.m. and I went into this pizza parlor, and he's there, kind of like all distraught, and I'm, like, what's going on? He's like, language, nothing means anything. And I was like, what do you, I don't understand. And then he starts going on saying, well, you see, and he goes on with it all about language. I'm like, but you're using language to express this to me. He's like, and it was very profound.
Yeah,
This was like a real existential crisis he was having,
yeah,
but he felt
yeah,
fundamentally disconnected from the real by feeling like everything just
yeah,
disappeared into meaninglessness. And of course, there's a profound performative contradiction because I was understanding what he was saying and getting his meaning by his language use. But
yeah,
anyway, I mention all that just because, this isn't just abstraction stuff. This is like this is the unmooring to reality that some of these directions of postmodern philosophical theorizing have tended to go
yeah,
in. And so there needs to be this rerouting back into appreciating how our language might indeed tap some reality, how meaning and value themselves might indeed actually tap some aspect of reality that is genuinely true, that doesn't necessarily have to, and then here it becomes the question, doesn't have to what? Doesn't how I approach it, have to be transcendently given from a kind of perennialist frame, right? I'm looking at these issues more from trying to understand, again, the kind of complexity of uh, people, let's just stick with people operating in contexts where they have goals. We need to breathe. We need to be able to drink water. We have basic drives and needs to just maintain our existence. And this goes all the way back into a very rich, complex evolutionary history that as we come to know that story better, we can see all of that in ourselves so that we're actually like, oh yeah, like my desire to do this actually is rooted in something that isn't just an idea in my head. It relates back to how do I maximize my own well-being and flourishing in the context of, the well-being and flourishing of other people around me, etc. I won't unpack all of my ideas about this because I've written
Mhm.
books and people can explore that. But it's a very different approach, I think, than what you're getting at potentially, which is something more like mm, if you do the contemplative practices and you have experiences of awakening, then there's a kind of perennialist wisdom that can successfully solve our, meaning and value crisis as we've framed it, and we just need to do that. And again, maybe that's kind of a caricature or it's an oversimplification at least. But
Mhm.
yeah, I'd love to collectively,
Mhm.
like inquire deeper into that and see how we can
Mhm.
maybe interpret that in different ways. Because, and then comes the
Mhm.
question version of this. What would you
Mhm.
say to someone who would suggest that, well, Brad, if you just say that, how is that different from a fundamentalist Christian saying, well, of course, the postmodernists screwed up value and meaning, but we have the truth in our gospel. And if people just believe the gospel of Jesus Christ, then everything would be fine. Or choose your other religion, right? Like there would be a way that people could see, well, if we're working with some notion of like enduring, eternal, perennialist insight and truth that's kind of always existed, um, you know, isn't that just a kind of form of pre-modern answer to these questions that was what got criticized, critiqued, and then deconstructed ultimately? And why should we privilege, the this tradition over this tradition? Questions like that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'm not yeah, I didn't say we know what's true because somebody in the past said it. There's no reference to um there's no claim for authority in a book or some ultimate authority or a reference external to oneself. I think once we acknowledge evolution, development, um, differences of perspective that are not relativist, then we're stuck with all of these same puzzles um, that I'm stuck with. I think you're stuck with the same puzzles as me. We just we just maybe draw the line in a different place in terms of what is ascertainable or possible to affirm. But either way, we're stuck with the fact that we would acknowledge that some perspectives are truer than others, some are more developed and mature than others, some are wiser than others. Um, and all I'm saying is when we sort of start to tell the story of the evolution of consciousness and culture, we start to understand the sort of modern left hemisphere sort of blind spot cul-de-sac that we're in. We start to understand, at least intuit, if not experience fully, sort of what it would mean to resolve those issues. What would it mean to embody the resolution of the deficient mental, right? What does it mean to live a life such that you're not stuck in left hemisphere cul-de-sac. You're not stuck in postmodern self-referential language games. You're not stuck in what Barfield calls alpha thinking. You've actually already transcended and included those basic structures in your experience of reality. You have an embodied direct perception of the fullness and meaningfulness and value of life. You actually share that in a very real, lived, and meaningful way with other people. You experience tremendous joy and love, regularly because you're so in tune and with reality
Hmm.
directly in an anthro-ontological, phenomenological way. And then you speak from that place. And when you speak from that place, you resonate with some people more than others.
Mhm.
And some people really resonate with that and can be brought into that, and you can help maybe pull some of those unfortunate folks who are having existential crises out of that through your relational joy. And maybe not everybody digs it. And I don't know what you ultimately do about those developmental disconnects. But my argument is that there is this process, and the reference to the perennial tradition it's not a reference to the past. It's simply a reference to the fact that many people have testified, like,
Mhm.
and they are ongoingly many people have tried to explain and are continuing to try to explain to us both how to transcend these problems and what it feels like and looks like and sounds like when you do so.
Mhm.
And that we can use our intelligence to discern who's worth listening to, right? Like who's a real teacher who's maybe gone further on the path than I have, who's worth listening to, and who's somebody who actually doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about, or they're just coming from actually maybe a lower structure than we are because they're pointing to some book or something, and that
Mhm.
doesn't resonate with us because we're already too rational to think that that has meaning, right? So does that make sense? It's just for me, it's sort of simple in a way, and it's all basically implied once you sort of get out of relativism and acknowledge development. There are actually a lot of things that follow from that.
Yeah. No, yeah, well, for sure on that last point, and I think one of the things that occurred to me when you were talking, which is an interesting thing to consider, is that I wonder about the plurality of options that are playing in this
Mm,
space, right? Like
yeah.
maybe this kind of perennialist insight wake up experience can solve this problem, but maybe also like awakening from the meaning crisis, relevance realization, you talk framing of, behavioral investment theory, blah, 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 can solve it. And maybe if they're leading to the same kind of outcomes, we can collectively realize that there's something like a construct awareness of like, well, that's one story and there's one story. But like, again, we're not getting
Mhm.
stuck in the stories. We're seeing how do people show up in the world and how do they act and what's the kind of wisdom that they're living from. Uh, so that was just a thought. I don't know what to make of it per se. Well, yeah, go ahead if you.
Yeah, well, just real quick on that. I mean, that's basically to sort of just take an abstract representation of that. That's sort of the point that Wilbur was trying to make when he created the Wilbur-Combs lattice of just distinguishing states and stages.
Mhm.
Because a way of like reinterpreting, I think what you just said, the basic insight is yes, there are all different kinds of state experiences that may have truth disclosure to them, but that does not imply anything about one's ability to interpret or
Mm.
understand or communicate or articulate a meaningful worldview through a very well-developed and inclusive structure of consciousness, right? So
Mhm.
you can have people who get very cognitively developed but don't have really tremendous state experiences of radical truth disclosure. And you can have people who have state experiences of truth disclosure, but then actually reinterpret it at a pretty low level and
Yeah,
become like a born again Christian or something. So there's this really complex, terrain which we're trying to map, even though the map's not the territory. We can try our best to get it. Okay, there's these different lines of development, there's states, there's stages, there's state stages. So that's part of the complexity of integral theory is trying to
sure.
account for those kinds of distinctions.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean it's a fascinating topic, and we can keep digging into this, or if you want, we
Mm,
can also pivot to some of the other fascinating things that you brought up in your series and
mm,
in other contexts.
hmm.
But yeah, I mean, no, I don't know, just some final thoughts,
Yeah.
or at least some additional. Yeah, there's something about that. I think that left hemisphere role in this that's intriguing to me, right?
Mm, hmm.
It's sort of like. Um, Maybe one way of asking this question is something like, did we just misframe the problem? Or is it something like there's a path that we need to follow? And those could also be related or versions of the same
Mm,
question, but it's something
hmm.
like, you know, okay, yeah, these postmodern theorists and the, building off of already very extreme left brain thinking from the modernist thinkers went in this direction. And it didn't work very well. And it kind of further detached people, arguably, from reality. Okay, no good. But was the problem that they weren't meditating enough, or was it that they were following a kind of hypothesis that ultimately dead ended and disconnected people further from reality? Like, those are
Mm,
kind of two different ways of asking, why did that go wrong? And similarly, right?
yeah.
Like, is someone who does experience a kind of deepening into wisdom through meditation, is it necessarily a product of the meditative experience, or is it, a kind of like general orientation towards trying to be in the body and experience reality with
Yeah.
depth and caring about existential questions. So,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to tease apart some of this field of fascinating ways that we're
Yeah.
approaching these shared topics. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I like the question, and I think we should keep unpacking it, because actually the thought that comes to mind is that the eightfold path is eightfold for a reason. You need to do a lot of different things right
Hmm.
in order to actually be growing and evolving in a healthy way as a human, right? So, and again, it's sort of a perennial wisdom insight that we've lost. And this is part of the impulse too, is like we have to recapture and reintegrate the lost wisdom of the traditions. Like people don't understand the Eightfold Path. They don't
Hmm.
understand that all eight of those things are necessary. And that's just one, and that doesn't mean everyone has to have that cultural frame. It means there's something really important and valuable about laying out this like full menu of all that it takes to actually be growing and evolving well, right? Like you need right view and right speech and right livelihood and right meditation and right concentration, right? Like you need all of these things together in an integral and holistic fashion. So for me, I would take that and update that in the 21st century, maybe with a Waldorf spin, and try to emphasize that like what we need is healthy environments for humans to grow. And a healthy environment for a human being would involve right relationship to technology, right relationship to parents, and secure attachment. It would involve having some meaningful stories and traditions of like, why are we here as human beings? Why are you here as a human? Why is the world a good place? Like in Waldorf, we actually emphasize the first 7 years, the focus should be on goodness. Young
Hmm.
children should believe and know fundamentally that the world is good
Hmm.
and that they are good. That's the most important thing. They have to know, in order to feel safe and be securely attached, you have to have a sense of basic goodness, right? You also have to have a sense of beauty and the importance of the creation of beauty. Only when you have goodness and beauty as foundational in your childhood can you pursue truth as you get older, right? So you can have a, Steinerian Waldorf framework, you can have a Buddhist framework, you can create your own, but the point is it has to be broad, it has to be holistic, it has to be many different things all together. So to answer your question, there were so many things that went wrong in modernity and postmodernity. I mean, we created a world that was disenchanted and sort of, separated from the sacred. We lost sense of meaningful story. We lost connection to esoteric religious traditions and practices. We lost a sense of basic goodness of ourselves and the world. We lost healthy family structures so that we have secure attachment with our parents. We lost a sort of broader tribe so that we can live in a multi-generational climate of elders. Like there's so much that we lost and there's so much that went wrong that we really have our work cut out for us now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, this is good. This is really good. I mean, uh, going back to something you mentioned earlier, right, from that kind of Barfield original participation, moving through, alpha thinking, and then on the final participation, there is this dialectical move there. If it's like a
Mhm.
differentiation and then an integration into something more holistic, it's a need to separate, which can be a painful thing, but then in
Mhm.
service of some kind of greater totality. So I share all of those, anxieties about the modern and postmodern worlds, about disenchantment and a number of the things that you said. And though I tend to frame them as a learning process, like
Yeah.
this was an unfolding thing that, yes, largely as we dug into trying to understand the world in greater depth and nuance and complexity, drawing, yes, indeed, a lot on our left hemisphere to do so, that created problems from doing things the way we had been doing, which had worked in various ways for a long, long time. Uh, but, that there is a value to those kinds of novel approaches as well. And that I think what we're kind of gesturing to, right, is like, how do we move through these things to get on the other side
Yeah.
of it? And so, just to say it again, and it's not a critique. It's just it's an interesting point in these approaches that we explore. And I've again explored this with Zach. Right? It's sort of like for me, I always get apprehensive if the notion of the solution or the way we resolve this is to somehow reclaim something that we've lost from the past, which isn't to say that that isn't a deep aspect to this, but right, if we just do that, then we're not moving through and beyond and learning by means of what we've done and carrying that forward as well. And I don't think that that's what you're saying either. I'm just saying that, like, for me, that's a big crucial aspect for how we think about this. And so, yeah, so for me, just to, I don't know, bring that to a point, it's like, there's something about, I think, the validity, ongoing validity of still using that left brain intellectual way of thinking to understand these deep questions. Like, I don't think a crude, way to understand, say, what McGilchrist is getting at is just, well, we need less left brain thinking and more right brain thinking, or like, at least that's not how I would read the solution. Is that, like, as we're learning more and we're deepening into reality, we're going to continue to have better and better left brain understandings of the big picture, and we shouldn't, like, denigrate that just because historically, as we've overemphasized it, it's created a lot of problems. But we also always need that left brain to be working, in balance with this right brain so that we're actually
Yeah.
using it to a purpose. So, yeah, for me, and then this was one last thing, was that,
Hmm.
like, as a personal experience of this, um, I needed certain kinds of ways to justify a more spiritual approach to these problems, let's say, right? Um,
Hmm.
because I think a lot of what people get stuck in, right, is like, oh, okay, I guess religion, spirituality, all that stuff is just dumb and wrong, and people were ignorant about it, and now we know that it's all material deterministic reductionism, blah blah blah. And it's like,
Hmm.
that's very unfortunate. But if you're somehow convinced of that, no one telling to you, no one telling you, well, just follow the Eightfold Path or just meditate or just, give your life over to Jesus Christ is going to change any of that, right? You actually need to, from within, as it were, the mental deficient cul-de-sac, find by means of those tools a way out of that cul-de-sac. And so I
Yeah.
think that that's a rather, again, kind of, maybe that's a kind of pejorative way of putting it. I think that there's value in articulating this move in the most kind of sophisticated intellectual way possible, particularly so that people can feel like it's a valid move to move back into the body,
Yeah.
into value, into meaning. And if we're lacking good explanations for that, then people are just gonna not see that as a viable option. So yeah, that's a lot of
Yeah.
thoughts I'm throwing at you there.
Well, but I'm no, I think I'm hearing you totally resonating with it and restating what I would say and what I'm saying. I mean that impulse to, like, I don't think anything that I've said or any of the people that I've referred to would disagree with you in
Hmm.
terms of the move is, again, the story is an evolutionary one. The story
Hmm.
is about the evolution of culture and consciousness. It's not about a big mistake. It's not a fall
Yeah,
from Eden
yeah.
story. That's not the story that I'm telling. And like Barfield and Steiner both were like really clear in agreement with you about like the deficiency of the mental, of the alpha thinking, the sort of tragedy of modernity is all actually necessary and good in the grand scheme of things.
Hmm.
Like it actually had to happen.
Hmm.
Like Steiner's view was like materialism is horrible. It's Ahriman, like understanding what's wrong with it, and it's necessary, and we can't fight it or change it. We have to move through it.
Hmm.
And Barfield said that we would look back in the future. We will look back on scientific materialism as that which liberated us
Hmm.
from original participation, so that we could find
Yeah,
final
yeah,
participation.
yeah.
I feel like all of these evolutionary schemas, basically all of the wisdom that has come from the modern world and later is finding a way to
Yeah,
tell that sort of dialectical evolutionary story.
yeah,
It's only versions of the story that emerged prior to modernity that maybe didn't have those chapters on yet.
yeah.
And in terms of the second thing you said, yeah, again, that's my exact experience was when I read books like The Altman Project or The Marriage of Science and Soul. It was that hyper rational, logical, developmental explanation of
Hmm.
why I had to meditate. Like that's
Yeah,
why it was important.
yeah.
For me, and I think for a lot of people, developmental psychology is the key to understanding rationally what you have to do to continue your own development,
Hmm.
right? And like having that sort of Keegan like insight of
Hmm.
like, oh my goodness, when it clicks, that one, like the next structure is actually able to take the previous structure as an object. Like
Hmm.
when you're able to look at your own mind as an object, you're actually looking from a meta perspective, then that is the evolution of the evolution of consciousness
Yeah.
in some real way. And when you get that rationally, you understand, oh wait, but that's actually what I'm doing when I meditate. I'm
Mm.
actually objectifying my mind and I'm expanding my subjectivity by objectifying the contents of my mind. And when I no longer identify with my own thoughts, I'm creating a kind of metacognitive space that is the engine of my own evolution and awakening
Mm.
because it's actually making it so that I'm metacognitive and construct aware. And the more construct aware I can be, the more I can actually be the space within which thoughts arise, and my whole identity and relationship to who I am in reality totally transforms.
Yeah. Again, oh man, you're such a brilliant a speaker and I was going to
Mm,
say interlocutor, but no, locutionist.
mm,
You is very very well said. No,
mm,
yeah, I think we are getting at that, and I've actually I've been feeling this in myself even more and more as I really move in this direction. That, I mean, so I talk a lot with uh, Bobby Azarian over chats here and there, and
mm,
he has a notion of meta naturalism where it's like as soon
yeah,
as you appreciate how the basic insight, right, that like a sufficiently advanced form of technology will be experienced as magic or indistinguishable from magic, then a lot of what we might have intuited earlier as magical can actually be understood to have deep
mm,
kind of causal relationships that are able to be understood. They are intelligible, but they're still magical, right? They're
mhm,
still incredible. And that at a certain point, when you realize how that just kind of continues to build on itself, the
mhm,
distinction between what we would want to classify as naturalistic and what we would then say, oh no, that's supernatural, or that's is like begins to become very challengeable or questionable. And so,
yeah,
the more I move into complexity thinking and emergence and these kinds of ideas and appreciate the profound uh, mystery that remains beyond what we know of in our scientific paradigm, notions that people were tapping into 2,000 years ago could be projective illusions, or they could also be ways that people were interfacing with hyperdimensional realities that are profoundly still naturalistic, but
yeah,
now we're getting closer to understanding the kinds of left brain thinking needed to articulate those kinds of more right brain
yeah,
experiential realities. So anyway, as that's been happening for me more and more, I've become more and more open to conceiving of ancient ideas in terms of these things that render them more possible and justifiable. And I think that that's kind of that interesting thing that as we move forward, we also reclaim more of things that we might have thrown away or objected to in the past. So anyway,
mhm.
that's a little bit more on that front. But yeah, well, go ahead if you had any more thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, it's just I guess the thought that came up for me was just yeah, thinking about that point that he's making, and I read Bobby's book as well, and I appreciate that project and sort of the overlaps between your guys' work. I do still think for I guess for me, there's a beautiful truth in what he's pointing to there, but for me, the way to access it is again through a sort of internal process,
Yeah.
through contemplative and meditative work. You do start to realize more and more how broad and expansive and open-ended possibility and reality can
Mm,
be, and realize more and more how the schema and the concepts and the ideas and the so-called physical laws that you've been trying to build your world sense making around, how actually maybe fluid and open those are. And for me it's sort of the like I think he's right. You do start to see how magical the world actually is,
mhm.
but not just through the evolution of technology,
Yeah. Yeah.
actually through the inner technology of actually realizing, um, again, how the constructs of our minds are just that, and also how some of the truth claims of spiritual and religious teachers are maybe more valid than we would otherwise give them credit for
Mm,
because you also start to develop a certain kind of epistemological humility,
hmm.
and this is actually another interesting sort of twist and distinction I think we can make. Like there's ways in which we need to cultivate epistemic humility around like hyper complex hyper objects, like things in the world that are really, really hard to know.
Hmm.
Like especially like things like politically, or like who killed
Yeah.
JFK, or what's up with vaccines? Like
Yeah.
things like that we need to have more humility about, you
Yeah.
know? And it's a shame that people are so sure that they're so right
Yeah.
when their information is so warped and so limited.
Yeah.
But at the same time, people have like a radical nihilism or relativism around absolute truths,
Mm.
where actually I feel like we can learn to trust more some people's truth disclosures and value disclosures if they've done the work and if what they're saying actually resonates with our own deepest intuitions of what's true and valuable. It's sort of like we have
Yeah.
to have less humility in this sort of spiritual arena, but
Mm.
only if it's careful. And we need to have more humility in like the manifest realm because we need to have an awareness of how imperfect our information ecology is.
Sure. Yeah, agreed. And I mean, it's an inherently kind of almost paradoxical,
Mm,
challenge because the wisdom that you need to identify wisdom is
mm,
itself something you need
yeah.
wisdom for, right? I think Kierkegaard actually, in an unrelated
Mm,
way, talks about some of this stuff in his own works relative to, this question of truth and how do we
mm,
know when we found truth because don't we need the truth
mm.
anyway. But without making it
Yeah.
hyper intellectualized, there's just this sense
Yeah.
of like you need to know what even to be looking for to know when you found it, and there's
Yeah.
kind of an irony there, but it's more like what are the criteria that we're using to assess when you're like, no, that person's really onto it, and I know not
Yeah.
just because it sounds good, but then it's like, what are those criteria? And you need wisdom to develop sound criteria, and I think
Yeah.
also those criteria themselves develop and they become more nuanced and sophisticated over the developmental journey.
Yeah.
So there's a lot.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't actually have a good answer to that one. That's an interesting sort of paradox of
Well,
how do you
I mean,
discern who to trust, and again, assuming that like if we're not, whether you're talking about actually in either realm, whether the manifest realm, who
mhm,
do I trust around vaccines or who do I trust about awakening? Either way, I need some discernment of
right.
how to make that judgment.
But I almost feel like that's a good argument to bring back with what we started with in a sense, which
Mm,
is the good, which is value, which is,
mm,
how do you know
mm,
that? And if you're so in your head about, oh, well,
mm,
it must reach certain criteria, but it's like we also feel when something is good. We feel when the
mm,
person we're talking to is giving us signs of trustworthiness, and we're able to interpret how they're acting in other contexts. And all of that creates a gestalt in which we're able to feel into some of that as well. And so, again, there's
yes.
kind of an irony there that, even with this vast left-brained modernist positivist vision of doing science and getting all this like it's a bunch of people communicating with each other and having a uh, phenomenological experience of truth claims, and what is right and what is not, and all of that. And so I think as we get detached from that is when we can just let
Mm,
that whole thing run away with itself, and we're no longer
mm,
actually being. And this gets to the whole AI thing, right? It's like, yeah, I guess, then you
yeah.
can start to justify these strange, ridiculous,
Yeah.
not just ridiculous, terrible, catastrophic,
Yeah.
dystopian futures, and
Yeah.
just sort of entertain them as like, yeah, well, that could happen.
Yeah. No, I really like what you just said, and thank you for saying it. I think it's really important. I want to try to come back to it. You said something about, yeah, it's embodied, it's felt. Like there
Yeah.
is a way in which there's this whole gestalt sort of reality that we're feeling into. And I think part of what resolves some of these big questions that you and others are exploring is what are the implications of that?
Mm,
Like, like it's not just through our concepts and language mediated, left hemisphere mediated kind of thinking that we discover truth. In fact, we start to realize that that's self-enclosed and like
mm,
keeping us from the broader opening that's open through our right hemisphere. But what kind of world are we living in? What does that mean that we can? It's when we relax. Sometimes I've talked to my friends about what I call the great relaxation, actually, in some of my sort of more awakened states. I feel it as a great relaxation where there's just this complete release and openness into the suchness of reality. And there's a direct communication
Mm,
between me and the world happening
yeah.
there about what's true and what's real and what's valuable and what's beautiful. And we can talk about it, but talking about it isn't it, but
Yeah.
we can
Yeah.
share it.
Yeah.
And but it's when you're trying to sort of speak and think from a place that's acknowledging the reality of that attunement
Yeah.
and that resonance that's possible between us and the world, because there is no between us and the world. It's just the world worlding and it's speaking right now through Brad. And what does that imply? What does that mean? What does that say about the kinds of metaphysical categories we want to come up with?
Yeah, and I think we're both of us walking around this whole thing that this space is really grappling with. You know, Greg Enriquez talks about the enlightenment gap. Obviously, people talk about the hard problem of
Mhm.
consciousness, these sorts of things, right? But like, I think it's getting at all this stuff, which is, okay, I have an experience of red, and you can't have that same experience, but I can use my words, and I can try to communicate to you. Oh, and I can use a word like red, and then based on your lived experience of redness, we can share that. And so we're not actually, we're tuning into our own embodied experience, but we're using a shared communication medium to do so, to be able to have a kind of shared mental state that we're engaging. But that's different from saying that like that we're doing the same exact thing at the same time. But then when you add on top of that, well, then you start studying, well, what is red in some kind of third person objective sense? And it's like, well, it's a particular wavelength, right? And it's like, or a spectrum of
Mm,
wavelengths. And then you
mm,
start defining it in those terms. Then you can say, well, what is red? Well, red is actually a wavelength. And so actually, we've never experienced red. We've just
mm.
experienced the, redness of our own. We wind up denigrating the very thing that we've used to
Yes.
abstract red. And then this misplaced concreteness thing, we're like, that's what red is. But we don't have any access to that because
Yes.
we don't know what a wavelength is in itself and all this stuff, right? So we wind up creating this huge philosophical problem for ourselves because we're not actually in tune with like what that actually is in its deeper sense. I think that that's kind of what we're getting
Yeah.
at is when you get back in tune with that, and
Yes.
then a lot of things become clear in a way that we're really out of whack when we were just like using this
Yeah.
way of thinking about things. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Abstraction as denigration.
Mm,
You're right. There's all kinds of um, tricks that we play on ourselves by overthinking things, and I think that's part of the ethics of sense making or
mm,
the integrity of meaning making is checking ourselves and each other about how tuned in and relaxed we are while we're doing our sense
mm,
making kind
hmm.
of thing too. Like we
Yeah.
have to catch ourselves when we start going down
Yeah.
those realms of like thinking about color and like as opposed to like if you and I are just sitting and like watching a sunset and like the meaning there, like the fullness of that shared experience, we can know that we're having a shared
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
And we could talk for hours if we want to
Right.
about how to prove that, but we knew it before we started talking.
Yeah.
And we can never lose touch with that kind of knowing, right? And
Yeah.
any kind of sense making we're going to be doing about metaphysics or learning or evolution should be coming from, and in some sense needs to be coming from for it to be true and beautiful and good, a shared resonance of this embodied sense of we're actually in this non-dual reality together.
Mm.
And let's go ahead and try to make sense of it for the benefit of all beings, but let's not trick ourselves into thinking that we're not sharing this non-dual reality together.
Hmm. Yeah, and there was a
Mm,
point to that red thing I wanted to throw into
mm,
based on all of what you just said, which is like red is a pretty neutral thing, but
mm.
good, you know,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
not just neutral. It's like it's value. It's
Mm,
not just value laden. It's value, right? But like we feel
mm.
value is kind of the thing I was getting at with all of that,
Yeah.
which is like, and if we stop making of value what we made of red, which is trying to define it abstractly as some kind of, wavelength on
Hmm.
a spectrum, blah, 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 blah. And we actually are like, no, we can sink into what we experience as value. And like that needs to
Hmm.
ground whatever kind of abstract descriptions that we have of it. But if we're disconnected from that, then it's going to be very hard for people to do good sense making. And
Yeah.
that is its own, kind of spiritual process of honing that skill of like, what is, I mean, well, I guess, Zach and Mark do talk about this, a kind of clarification of value,
Yeah.
clarification of eros, like getting clear about actually what is of desire, of value. And I think that I want to tie all of that back in, though we should
Mm,
also probably move
hmm
towards a close soon. But there's a big way in which, as we've created this whole left-brained world for ourselves, we are creating an environment that we're living in that forces us to be more and more detached from that kind of reality.
mm,
And so
hmm
we get moved further and further away from it. And then that, of course, feeds on itself. And then we wind up getting more and more detached about our thinking because we're losing connection with that. So a lot of, I think what going forward, needs to be front and center with socialization and culturation and education is like, yeah, sticking with the lived aspects of these things and grounding them out. And obviously, places where you're at, that's what you're all about. And
hmm
yes, this is amazing. I love this. This is wonderful.
hmm
What are some kind of final thoughts if you want to start to wrap this up a little bit?
mm.
Yeah, that you'd want to throw in.
Yeah, it's a lot. I think we covered some good ground. I'll just affirm that, yeah, my thinking is very much in alignment with Zach and Mark and Ian.
Hmm.
It's actually been cool to watch them come from different places and land in a very similar place in terms of the focus on value and
Yeah.
attention and what they call valueception. I resonate with that a lot, and I've
Hmm.
sort of come to it also somewhat through them and somewhat independently, also with a focus on attention
Hmm.
and concerns about technology.
Hmm.
And one of the themes that I'm really trying to weave into what I share with my community and parents and related to education, maybe the last point that I'll make is to bring the importance of attention really
Yeah.
is primary in all of this. Attention is the the essence of cultivating meditation. It's the essence of cultivating value and value perception. It's the essence of cultivating right relationship and all the other right things that a good Buddhist would want you to do. Um, and it is the thing that is being most harmed and degraded by digital technology.
Yeah.
So it's like we have to figure out how to value attention and how to cultivate our attention and create environments that are healthy and educational and developmentally appropriate in the sense that we're helping children develop long attention spans, right?
Hmm.
Instead of perpetual boredom and short attention spans of TikTok screens, we need to slow down.
Hmm.
And the implications of all that we've said do have really concrete implications for things like how to live, how to raise children, how to regulate technology, how to be in relationship to AI. It does get very concrete, and I feel like the way that you're living up in Vermont and the way that I'm living in Pennsylvania are pretty concrete, instantiated embodiments of like the implications of these things when you really start to think them through. They have implications for how you live your life,
Mm.
and it has to do with being in relationship to nature and being in relationship to a certain sort of pace.
Mm.
Um, so, it can go from really abstract and philosophical to very just concrete and simple and meaningful. And
Yeah.
and it's all woven together really beautifully. And it's possible, so I feel like it's enheartening
Mm.
because it is possible to actually think through these things and get to a place where it actually makes sense, and then you have direction for how to live your life. And we have to simply find a way to keep spreading the good news and get more people to be living healthfully.
Mm.
We have to help people be healthy and sane and be able to pay attention, hopefully to long conversations like this.
Yeah. Amen, brother. That was beautiful.
Yeah.
And yeah, I totally agree. So that's really wonderful. I appreciate again your eloquence to be able to express these things
Thank
so
you.
well. And yeah, I mean, just finally, one last observation for myself is like I
Hmm
think I do come at this much more through a kind of uh Vervaekean lens, and I don't know yet if I don't. I know that Vervaeke and McGilchrist have spoken. I don't know if anyone's really done an attempt to really
Mm.
synthesize their approaches,
Yeah.
and it's not also just Vervaeke. I'm thinking, Greg Enriquez and Vervaeke have very much synced up their models, and now there's some really exciting things to sync up Greg's work with the integral model. But maybe it is just, I don't want to separate it into left and right because I think it is actually there are
Hmm.
left and right components of
Hmm.
all of this, but there is a different way of languaging some of this that I think would be really, I'd love to see that in more explicit dialogue with some of the ways that, Zach and Mark and folks kind of language some of it and drawing more on that Steiner tradition and Matt Segal. There are kind of these two big traditions I'm seeing,
Yeah.
or lineages, where we're really converging on something, but we're using some different language about it. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure how much light there is between these,
Yeah.
but yeah, some of that work would be
Yeah, no,
well
it's
done.
interesting overlap. It's definitely a lot of overlap. I mean, I'm very much in resonance with cosmoerotic humanism, and I
Mm,
think McGilchrist is easily woven into
mm,
that. I have a background sort of in Whitehead and
mm.
Steiner, which is similarly interesting to Matt,
Yeah,
and coming at it from more of a sort of Buddhist practitioner side, whereas Zach and Mark have sort of the Jewish mysticism
yeah,
side. I feel like that's part of it too. Like to what degree it really some of it comes down to really what lineages and teachers have you been informed by, and that's going to flavor,
sure,
how you express things, whether you're coming from an influence of a psychology. I think all those differences of the people you named really comes down
mm,
to we're all coming from different traditions, but actually what we're building is this arch-disciplinary
mm.
vision. And actually, I also did read the book that you guys put out about
Oh, cool.
arch-disciplinary whatever,
Hmm.
ARC.
Yeah,
And I've also been in conversation with Corey David Barker a little bit. And, so many good people in the space. We're all moving in the same direction. It's really beautiful to see things getting woven together.
100%. And right now, the Institute of Applied Meta Theory is also doing excellent work in the same space. And
Yeah,
yeah, things are really coming together, and there's a lot of momentum there.
sweet.
Um, Brad Kershner, thank you so much. This was really
Yeah.
delightful, my friend. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to doing another conversation down the line. And I'll post a link to those videos that you did that kind of were the impetus for this. But I thought, yeah, this was really just wonderful and a great time to get into some really important, valuable stuff. So appreciate it, Brad. And yeah, we'll be in touch, my friend.
Yes, thank you.